Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are immersing ourselves in a really fascinating and honestly quite technical piece that's been doing the rounds online. It's a comprehensive thread titled How Physics Supports Monotheism and Undermines Polytheism, Shirk.
Yeah, this one's definitely caught some attention, and it's a remarkable exercise in intellectual strategy, I think. We're
Sure.
looking at something far beyond just a simple theological essay.
Right.
It's more like, you could almost call it philosophical reframing. It's this strategic attempt to take foundations usually linked with secularism, specifically materialist physicalism,
Okay.
and then use that very framework to achieve what the author, Muhammad Abu Abdurrahman, describes as exceptional philosophical clarity, improving God's existence and oneness.
I like that description you used before intellectual judo, taking the opponent's own strength, which here is this modern focus on matter, energy, objective reality,
Exactly.
and flipping it, using it as the force to argue for a singular external creator. So, our mission for this deep dive is really to unpack how this synthesis works. How does the author weave together concepts from, say, particle physics with these classical theological structures, specifically mentioning Ibn Taymiyyah?
It is definitely a challenging mix, no doubt. But, when you actually follow the thread, the argument itself flows very logically. The starting point is absolutely key. The author sets up these incredibly strict boundaries for what the universe is.
Okay.
And once you accept those boundaries, the rest of the argument for God's existence, his oneness, it follows almost mathematically, you could say.
Okay, let's unpack that starting point then. We need to define physicalism the way the author uses it here, because it's not just a casual nod to materialism, is it? It's presented as a really rigorous foundational premise. What's the actual boundary condition being set?
Yeah, it's super strict. The author lays down this incredibly rigid definition of existence. Physicalism, in this specific context, basically asserts that nothing exists in the world beyond matter and energy, or, things that are fundamentally reducible to matter and energy.
Okay.
But the really critical part is space-time. All things that exist must be spatially and temporally related. They have to be located somewhere within the four-dimensional continuum of space-time.
So location becomes the ultimate test for reality here. If you can't pinpoint something in space and time, then by this definition, it's simply non-existent. Is that it?
That's the strict interpretation the thread demands, yes.
Hmm.
Anything lacking spatial or temporal coordinates is explicitly considered non-existent, at least in the real external world. And this is, philosophically speaking, a huge move. It's like a hammer blow, because it immediately dismisses whole categories like, say, abstract substances or Platonic universals. The idea of treeness or justice existing independently out there.
Right, outside the mind.
Exactly. They can't exist extramentally if they don't have coordinates. And for a theological argument, starting here as well, it's pretty radical, maybe even risky.
It feels risky because it demands such consistency. If the universe is strictly spatiotemporal, what does that do to entities that theology traditionally considers non-physical? Things that don't seem to occupy space and time in a way we can easily measure. I'm thinking angels, jinns, souls, that whole unseen realm.
And this is where the strategy gets particularly sharp. The author just bites the bullet and asserts that this physicalist principle applies across the board, universally, which means these unseen beings, they also must exist spatiotemporally.
Really? Angels, jinn?
Angels, jinn, the human soul, even places like paradise and hellfire. The argument insists all of these must be reducible somehow to some form of matter or energy, or at least exist within the physical universe.
Hold on. If the soul itself is physical, reducible to matter or energy, doesn't that risk gutting the traditional idea of an immortal soul? Couldn't it just become like a biological function that stops when the body dies? How does the author avoid that kind of reductionism?
That's the crucial balancing act the thread tries to perform. It stresses that these entities are physical only in the sense that they occupy space-time and are subject to causal laws. Their actual substance is considered fundamentally different from the matter we know.
So not ordinary matter.
Not ordinary matter or energy as we currently understand it, maybe not even observable by us, but they must exist within those established physical boundaries. By insisting they're spatio-temporal, the author keeps them from being seen as potentially self-subsisting, eternal beings that could rival God. The strategy is to force everything, seen and unseen, into this one box labeled contingent space-time existence.
Okay, that clarifies the strategic value here, but why? Why adopt this almost counterintuitive materialist lens if the ultimate goal is theological proof?
Well, the author explicitly states the goal is to establish a foolproof, lucid grasp of creation which Satan will never be able to distort. The underlying premise seems to be that polytheism, or shirk, often springs from what's called a distorted, creative, and unscientific metaphysics.
Meaning?
Meaning, when people allow for ambiguous, vaguely defined, or sort of isolated entities to exist outside clear causal chains, well, they open the door to potentially worshiping those things or seeing them as lesser gods.
I see. So by forcing everything from a tiniest energy flicker to the mightiest angel into this single spatio-temporal box, you cement the idea that all existence is contingent, it's all interconnected, it's all operating within one unified system.
And therefore entirely dependent on a cause outside that box.
Exactly. You strip away the metaphysical fog that might allow for independent mini-deities to hide.
You make the entire universe, seen and unseen, one single describable entity.
Precisely, and that tidies things up perfectly for the next big step, proving that this single entity isn't eternal itself, but is actually perpetually contingent, constantly needing to be originated. Okay, so this brings us to the core cosmological argument. The thread pushes back against two common ideas about creation. First, ex nihilo, creation from absolutely nothing. And second, the idea that matter is eternal and just gets, rearranged into different shapes, which you sometimes find lurking in certain materialist views. Instead, the author pushes for substantial origination. Why is rejecting that eternal rearranging substance idea so critical here?
It's critical because if matter itself were eternal, just endlessly rearranging, then matter would share a fundamental attribute, eternality, with God. That gives the material world a kind of ontological status that's uncomfortably close to the creators. It could lead to confusion, maybe thinking the world is self-sustaining.
Right.
So to counter that, the author reaches back into classical philosophy specifically to argue that matter itself is contingent, it's created, and it can be annihilated.
And this is where Ibn Taymiyyah comes in, with that argument about the impossibility of infinite actual division. That sounds incredibly dense. How does that argument get us to the creation of matter itself?
It's actually quite an elegant philosophical argument, almost like a trap for eternal matter proponents. Ibn Taymiyyah basically argued, look, if any piece of matter could be actually divided infinitely, not just potentially, but actually divided an infinite number of times, then even its smallest possible unit would still contain an infinite number of parts within it.
Okay.
Logically, that makes the thing impossible to ever fully exist or be instantiated. Because it would never reach a definite state, it would always be infinitely divisible, lacking a final essence or boundary, since we clearly do observe distinct material substances existing.
They must have some endpoint to division.
Exactly. The physical substance must reach a point where, if you divide it further or influence it causally, its very substance doesn't just get rearranged, it fundamentally changes into something else, or just ceases to exist as that substance.
So the impossibility of infinite division is used to show that matter has to be unstable, contingent, subject to being, annihilated and replaced. It's not just the form changing, but the actual underlying substance.
That's precisely the takeaway, and this leads directly into the core concept here, substantial origination. The definition given is that matter and energy literally annihilate during natural processes, and then new matter and energy originate in their place. Material things pop into and out of existence as distinct substances, not just in one big bang, but constantly as part of ongoing processes.
And the thread calls this origination ex materia, which means matter originates substantially, yes, but its creation needs preceding material conditions, conditions which then completely cease to exist in that process.
Yes, precisely. It's creation from matter, but the starting material is totally transformed. It undergoes a genuine ontological loss. The original stuff gone.
Okay, and this is where the classical argument suddenly finds a modern echo in physics. That's the surprising bit.
It is. The author points straight to particle physics, specifically processes like particle-antiparticle collisions.
You mean like when an electron and its antiparticle, a positron, collide? They vanish.
They vanish, yes. They annihilate each other and produce photons' pure radiation energy. The thread really hammers this point. This isn't just rearrangement like in chemistry. A quark or an electron is not just a configuration of photons. They're fundamentally different types of particles, different properties, different masses.
So the original substance is truly lost, ontologically speaking. It stops being that substance, and a new substance, photons, radiation originates right there.
Exactly. And that demonstrates, in a scientifically observable way, that matter and energy systems are inherently contingent. They can cease to be what they are.
And if you generalize that, as the thread seems to do, to basically all energy transfer, then every time system A gives energy to system B, system A is, in a sense, losing some of its ontological existence.
That's the reasoning. And if a system can lose some of its existence in every transaction, then, the author argues, it must logically be capable of losing its entire existence. This constant changeability, this flux, which we see everywhere in physics, proves that all material systems are contingent. They accept both existence and non-existence. They are totally dependent.
Wow. This whole line of argument makes the causal principle feel absolutely inescapable. If existence is constantly being lost and then substantially re-originated, that origination must have a cause. And the thread uses this quite cleverly to both affirm causality and simultaneously argue against ex nihilo creation.
It's a neat maneuver, isn't it? The first law of thermodynamics, matter and energy can't be created or destroyed. They just change form, gets co-opted here. The thread agrees with the first law, but interprets it not as a denial of creation altogether, but specifically as a denial of ex nihilo creation, creation from absolute nothing. Instead, the author insists substantial origination always happens through a preceding cause. This makes it the strongest possible instance of the causal principle in action. Matter needs a cause, even more fundamentally, for its very substance to originate after it wasn't there.
Okay. So, we've used physicalism to establish the universe as one interconnected spatiotemporal system. We've used substantial origination to show this system is perpetually contingent, constantly needing creation. The logical next step has to be identifying the ultimate source of that continuous origination.
Right, and this is where we shift gears slightly, moving from physics more towards metaphysics, but crucially, always keeping that causal principle right in the foreground. The key intellectual move here is to distinguish between two different types of causal acts.
Okay, what are they?
Well, first, there's the generative act. This is what we usually think of as causation, secondary or material causation. Existing material things acting on other existing material things. Parents having a child, reactants forming a product.
Got it. Standard cause and effect within the system.
Exactly. But then there's the originative act. This is primary causation. This is the cause that's responsible for actually endowing the very substance of the effect with existence right after it was non-existent. This is the act of creation itself. And the thread argues this is the highest demand of the causal principle.
And the dilemma is, if the entire material world, the whole substrate, is contingent, as argued before, it can't perform this originative act on itself. It can't pull itself up by its own bootstraps, existentially speaking. So the originator must be external.
Precisely. And the thread offers two main strategies to prove this necessity. Strategy one is focused on the impossibility of internal control.
Okay.
This argument insists that a true originator cause must be completely responsible for and continuously sustain its effect, like down to every last particle, every attribute, every single thing that happens to it.
So using the earlier example, if I were the true originator of my child, not just the generative cause, I'd have to be constantly, actively sustaining their existence, their biology, their life, even if I wasn't physically present.
That's the implication. But physics itself, as defined under physicalism, strictly prohibits attributing that kind of full, continuous controlling agency to anything within the material world. Material causes only act in that limited, secondary, generative way. Parents die, children keep living, the secondary cause disappears, the effect persists for a while.
Okay.
So the argument goes, the originative act does exist because substantial origination is happening constantly, but it cannot be attributed to matter itself. Therefore, it must belong to an originator outside the material system entirely.
And that external nature automatically points to the originator being eternal.
It has to. Because if the originator were itself contingent, part of the material system, it too would be subject to annihilation and would need its own originator. That leads straight into an infinite regress within the system, which contradicts the whole idea of the system being contingent in the first place.
Right. It would need a cause outside itself eventually.
Yes. And that's exactly the point the thread highlights by quoting the Quran. Were they created by nothing? Or were they the creators of themselves? It logically forces you to reject those two internal possibilities. Either origination doesn't happen, or things create themselves, since neither is true based on the preceding arguments.
The cause must be external. Got it. What's strategy two?
Strategy two is the classic argument from contingency, but applied to the entire material substrate at once.
Okay, zooming out.
Zooming way out. We've established that all individual substances within the system are contingent. They don't possess existence inherently from their own nature. This argument says you can't just take an infinite collection of things that fundamentally lack existence in themselves and expect them to magically combine into something that does have existence as a whole.
Yeah, like stacking up an infinite number of zeros doesn't suddenly give you a 1.
Exactly that kind of logic. Therefore, the entire set of contingent material substances, the whole shebang, space-time, and everything in it, cannot possibly have existence originating from itself. It must depend on an external, non-contingent cause, a maker who is absolutely independent and exists necessarily by his own nature.
So by rigorously applying physicalism and causality, we've logically derived this originator who must be eternal, independent, the single source of the originative act. Now this brings us back to that really tricky point you mentioned earlier, the one stemming from the physicalism constraint itself. The thread concludes the originator is spatiotemporal, located above his creation upon his throne, but insists it's wrong to call him a body or corporeal. How on earth does the author navigate that theological tightrope?
Yeah, this is arguably the most complex synthesis in the whole piece because it bumps right up against some very traditional theological doctrines. To satisfy that initial physicalist rule from Part 1, that existence demands location, the creator has to be defined as spatiotemporal, located somewhere relative to creation, above or upon it, drawing on scriptural language.
Because if God wasn't spatiotemporal,
Then by the thread's own starting definition of physicalism, he'd be non-existent.
yeah.
So he must have a location.
But calling God spatiotemporal sounds dangerously close to Tawhid anthropomorphism, giving God body-like qualities, which is a major red line in much of classical Islamic theology.
It absolutely is. The author tries to handle this by adopting the specific safeguards used by the theological school he's drawing from, likely Ibn Taymiyyah's approach. While affirming God has a spatial location relative to creation, he is above it, distinct from it, they simultaneously negate all the negative implications that usually come with the word body or corporeal.
Meaning things like having limits, needs, being composed of parts, being subject to change or annihilation.
All of those created properties. By negating those limitations, the author aims to say, yes, God is localized, he is spatiotemporal in the sense of having a place relative to creation, but he is not a contingent, divisible, needy, created substance like everything in creation. He exists in relation to space, but not like the space-time objects he made. It's a fine line, but it allows the argument to maintain its physicalist consistency while trying to uphold God's absolute uniqueness and necessary existence.
Okay, so we've argued for the existence of this single, external, eternal originator. The next massive hurdle, logically and theologically, is proving the absolute oneness of this creator. This is Tawhid al-Rububiyya, the oneness in lordship in creative power. And this seems to be where that initial premise of the universe as one single interdependent material system really comes back into play, doesn't it?
Absolutely vital. That single interconnected system, established way back in Part 1 using physicalism, becomes, according to this argument, the final nail in the coffin for polytheism.
Shirk.
Well, think about it. If the universe could be neatly divided into, say, two totally separate, isolated realms that never interact, then maybe, just maybe, you could logically conceive of two gods, each ruling their own domain without interference.
Okay, theoretically.
But physicalism, as defined here, insists that's impossible. Everything is interconnected. Every particle affects every other particle, eventually. The thread uses this fact as the basis for two powerful arguments drawn from the Quran to refute any possibility of multiple lords.
Right, let's break those down. Argument 1, the argument from interconnectedness. How does universal interdependence logically undermine the idea of two lords?
Because the universe is this single, tightly woven web of cause and effect, every single originated substance from a distant star to a quark inside you is fundamentally connected to every other substance. As the thread puts it, there's absolutely no room for a created system to be totally isolated from ours.
Okay, so if a hypothetical second lord, supposedly equal and independent, tried to create something new on their own,
That new creation, let's call it substance X, would instantly become part of the existing causal network. It would interact with and be influenced by everything else.
and that's the problem.
That's the fatal problem for dual lordship. If this second lord independently creates substance X, then the first lord, the one who created, say, substance Y, might now find that substance Y depends on substance X to exist or function properly within the overall system.
Ah, so the first lord suddenly becomes dependent on the creative act of the second lord.
Exactly. And that immediately shatters the established property of the originator needing to be absolutely necessary, independent, and self-sufficient. A truly necessary being cannot logically depend on an assistant, a partner, or anyone else's actions.
It's like the buck has to stop somewhere, with one ultimate source.
Precisely. The author really emphasizes that God must be the creator of both the effects and their causes, all traced back to him. If you're splitting up, one Lord makes the causes, another makes the effects, or one Lord creates raw materials, another uses them, then both Lords become mutually dependent. And that dependency is impossible for a being defined by necessary existence.
And the thread cites Quran 23.91 here. Never did Allah take to himself a son, nor was there ever any God with him. If there had been, then each God would take away what he created.
Yeah, that quote is used brilliantly here because the implication of each God would take away what he created is that they can't actually do that successfully. Creation is inherently interconnected. They would try to isolate their domains, but the unified nature of reality prevents it. This interconnectedness forces the conclusion that the true originator must be the single source of all the necessary causal chains.
And the thread makes another sharp point here, criticizing proponents of ex nihilo creation again, arguing they actually weaken this oneness argument without realizing it.
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
The logic is, if you argue God can create something from absolute nothing without any preceding material cause, ex nihilo, then you're essentially saying God can sever the necessary links between material entities at will.
Okay.
But if those links can be arbitrarily severed, then maybe totally isolated systems are theoretically possible. And if isolated systems are possible, you lose the force of this structural argument that proves two Lords couldn't coexist without undermining each other's independence and sufficiency within the single interconnected system. By sticking firmly to ex materia creation, where creation requires preceding conditions, ultimately sourced from the first cause, the thread preserves the logical necessity of that unified interdependent system.
That makes sense. And this flows straight into the second argument against polytheism, doesn't it? The argument from subjugation.
Exactly. Given the system is fundamentally one, it simply cannot be sufficiently caused or governed by two fully independent, equally powerful creator lords acting simultaneously. The sufficiency principle kicks in. If one Lord is truly sufficient to create and sustain the entire universe,
then the existence of a second, equally sufficient Lord for the exact same effect becomes logically redundant and impossible, like two different builders trying to exclusively build the exact same single house at the same time.
Precisely. Their wills, their plans, their actions would inevitably conflict or interfere, which leads directly to the second part of that same Quranic verse, 23.91. And some would overcome others.
Meaning conflict is inevitable.
Conflict is inevitable. If multiple gods existed, they would necessarily end up struggling for dominance over the single, unified creation.
And logically, only the winner, the most powerful one who successfully overcomes the others, could possibly be the true, necessary, eternal, independent originator. Any others are, by definition, defeated, subjugated, limited.
And therefore needy, contingent creations themselves. They'd be part of the material substrate, not co-equal gods above it. It creates this really tight philosophical conclusion, all flowing from those initial rules set in part 1. Physicalism forces interconnectedness. Interconnectedness forces dependency arguments, and that dependency logically mandates a singular, necessary, independent originator. Game over for polytheism, according to this line of reasoning.
Okay, so we've walked through the arguments establishing Tawhid al-Rububiyyah, the oneness of God in his lordship and creative power. The final crucial part of this deep dive has to be connecting that intellectual understanding to the ultimate theological purpose of the whole exercise. The shift from recognizing the one creator to actively submitting to him. That's Tawhid al-Uluhiyyah, right? Oneness in worship.
That is absolutely the endpoint, yes. It's where the metaphysical necessity derived through physics and logic meets practical, lived reality. The conclusion is stark but simple. If God alone is the eternal, independent creator, the sole originator, the Lord who continuously sustains every single particle of existence, that it follows logically that he alone is the true deity, the Elah, the one who deserves our complete worship, our ultimate love, our deepest submission, and our unwavering trust.
The link seems almost self-evident once you accept the premises, but the sheer weight of the preceding arguments grounding it in physicalism, substantial origination, is meant to make that conclusion rationally inescapable, isn't it?
That's the goal. If you follow the physics and the logic laid out, the conclusion demanding singular worship becomes not just a matter of faith, but a matter of rational necessity. And conversely, the thread strongly emphasizes that failing to recognize this singularity committing shirk, or polytheism, is presented as the root cause of all corruption and misery. By attributing God's exclusive rights the right to be worshipped, obeyed, loved supremely, trusted ultimately, because he is the sole creator and sustainer to created contingent beings, whether angels, prophets, saints, idols, or anything else. One introduces a fundamental distortion into one's relationship with reality. It's seen as metaphysical and moral chaos. The thread goes so far as to label the conscious rejection of monotheism after understanding the proofs as stemming from an utterly corrupt heart.
That's very strong language. And the consequence mentioned for dying in that state of conscious rejection is severe, permanent hellfire. It's framed as resulting from a heart that's fundamentally dysfunctional, actively resisting the being who objectively has the greatest possible right to that love and submission. Now, given how intense that sounds, we absolutely need to make sure we cover the crucial nuances the thread includes regarding accountability and forgiveness. It's not quite as simple as disagree and you're doomed, is it?
No, definitely not. And that theological balance is essential to understanding the framework properly. The thread is careful to emphasize that this severe consequence is specifically reserved for those who reject the truth after it's been presented clearly, after they've had the full capacity to understand it, and then consciously turn away out of arrogance, pride, or adherence to tradition over reason.
So this immediately addresses the question of people who never heard the message clearly or lacked the capacity to grasp it.
Exactly. This brings in the important classical doctrine of al-Fatra. This refers to people who lived in times or places where no clear prophetic message reached them, or individuals who, due to perhaps intellectual disability or extreme isolation, genuinely lacked the capacity to process the evidence, even if they encountered it.
And what happens to them, according to this view?
The thread clarifies, consistent with classical sources, that they aren't judged based on knowledge they couldn't possibly have obtained. God's justice precludes that. Instead, they will be tested individually and fairly on the day of judgment in a way appropriate to their situation. If they pass that specific test, they enter paradise.
So accountability is tied to knowledge and capacity.
Precisely. The core principle is that God doesn't punish anyone until the message, the clear proof, has actually reached them and they've had a fair chance to consider it. No one is condemned simply due to historical accident or lack of opportunity.
Okay, that's a vital clarification. And what about the scope of forgiveness for believers, people who accept the oneness of God but still commit other sins?
Well, that scope is presented as vastly wider, which reinforces the idea that the utterly corrupt heart judgment is really focused on that foundational rejection of the Creator's oneness. The thread notes, again drawing on standard theology, that God accepts sincere repentance right up until the moment of death approaches.
And even if a believer dies having committed sins without repenting?
Even then, the belief in the one God means their heart is considered essentially good at its core, capable of purification. They might face a period of temporary punishment or purification for their specific wrongdoings, but eventually, even someone with just the slightest amount of faith in the one God will enter paradise. They won't remain in the fire permanently, unlike the one whose heart fundamentally rejected the singular right of the originator.
Right. So the entire complex exercise, starting with that strict physicalism, proving substantial origination, arguing for the single external originator, it's all designed as this rational pathway. A pathway meant to solidify the absolute theological requirement of singular worship, uluhiyya, built directly upon the rationally established oneness of lordship, rububiyya, while still carefully maintaining those crucial theological principles of divine justice and broad forgiveness.
Exactly. So when we try to synthesize this whole deep dive, what we've really looked at is this remarkably coherent, modern-feeling framework, yet one built squarely on classical foundations. The author genuinely seems to have executed that intellectual judo we talked about at the start. They've taken the language of modern physicalism concepts like matter-energy annihilation, strict spatio-temporal location, universal interdependence, things often seen as secular, and they've leveraged it to construct what they present as a robust intellectual safeguard for monotheism. This framework doesn't run away from the material world, it dives right into it, aiming to force even a materialist thinker to conclude that their own observations of physical law actually necessitate a singular, external, eternal cause.
It forces a really fascinating, maybe uncomfortable reconciliation for some. If you accept the modern scientific picture of matter and energy being contingent, always changing, and you accept the universality of the causal principle, then this argument insists you must also accept substantial origination. And that, in turn, logically demands a single eternal originator who exists outside the system. The very laws of physics become, in this view, signposts pointing directly to God's
And
oneness.
that's really the core claim, the brilliance perhaps of the thread strategy. It insists that physicalism, if you really understand it correctly, meaning if you understand it implies this perpetual creation, this substantial origination, and this absolute universal interdependence, then it's not a gateway to atheism at all. Instead, it offers this clear, contemporary, rational framework to challenge both atheism and polytheism head-on.
So we'll leave you, our listeners, with this final provocative thought pulled straight from the implications of the source material. If this kind of theological synthesis holds water, is physicalism truly an enemy of faith? Or could it be, when rigorously applied and understood in this specific way, perhaps the most potent intellectual safeguard for monotheism available in our modern age? Does this kind of reframing fundamentally change how you might view the relationship between physics and metaphysics? Could you, for example, start seeing something like the first law of thermodynamics, not just as a physical principle, but as an inherently theological proof point hinting at a necessary eternal cause beyond the system? Something to definitely chew on.